Good morning. Okay, well, I want to first thank Ellen Lapson for organizing this conference. I've known Ellen for many years, and she is one of the most strategic and holistic thinkers on security. And so thank you, Ellen, for your leadership. And like Ellen Frost, I'm going to take a broader perspective on climate and environmental issues across Asia. But a little bit like Jack and Aaron Friedberg, I am going to also focus particularly in some aspects on China. So the subtitle of this talk is Climate Security in the Asia-Pacific Region, Disaster Ally or Resilience Leader. You pick. When it comes to understanding the impacts of climate change on national security, no region is more important than Asia. Of course, you know it's home to 60% of the world's population and produces almost half its goods. Southeast Asia and the Pacific Island nations will be the hardest hit by climate change of anywhere on the planet, and those states with less developed economies and infrastructure are particularly ill-equipped to deal with its challenges. So this means climate change dangerously disruptive and destabilizing effects on the region will be felt around the globe. But it's also a chance to sort of address these challenges in a holistic way. So let's talk about the weather and the water. Okay. In the weather, first, climate change is fundamentally altering weather patterns throughout Asia, starting with significant temperature increases. If you Asia watchers have seen, it's been a record hot summer across parts of Asia, great heat wave in Japan. Upward temperature trends are notable, and by 2030s, half of all summers will be warmer than the record hot summers of the past 40 years. And you can see that our 90-degree days, that's often a common unit of measurement, are increasing dramatically across significant parts of the globe. Okay, second, climate change is reshaping water distribution and availability, producing droughts and as well as flooding across Asia and straining a lot of water resources. Most climate models project a decrease in precipitation during the dry season and increase during the monsoon season. And freshwater availability in most parts of Asia, particularly in large river basins, is projected to decrease by the 2050s. That's important. We're going to come back to that. That water is important to Asia. Droughts are going to be especially severe across South Asia, even as rainfall patterns are increasingly deviating from historical norms. We're not in the new normal of weather anymore, and becoming harder to predict. In the wet tropical regions in East and Southeast Asia, runoff's going to increase close to 40% with widespread flooding in coastal areas. And we're seeing this already. A very good example, of course, is the sea level rising and flooding across Bangladesh. Okay, third, the higher temperatures have important implications for extreme weather events, and in particular, cyclones. There's regional variation, of course, but they're going to intensify and the number of storms could rise. In China, while the frequency of cyclones has actually decreased, their destructive force has grown. And right now, there's a terrific typhoon that's run across Japan, closed one of the major airports in Osaka. One of the interesting sort of geopolitical dimensions of this is that China refused to evacuate Taiwanese citizens when it evacuated its own citizens from Osaka. So we're seeing the increasing geopolitics brought by extreme weather events. Okay, let's talk now about the security implications. I want to talk about the indirect threats, and then we'll talk about some direct threats. Okay. Indirect threats are when climate change acts as what I've called a threat multiplier, phrase I coined about 11 years ago now with the Center for Naval Analysis Military Advisory Board, which I founded, which is now over 40 retired generals and admirals who become a leading voice on national security, climate change, and energy. And we talked about climate change as producing instability in fragile regions of the globe. That was 11 years ago now. But we see that it's affecting us well, where we live at home as well. And we can get into that more later if you're interested. So extreme weather events and patterns raise the risk of humanitarian disasters, water and food shortages, population migration, labor shortfalls, price shocks, power outages, all of which affect poorest people the most. So small nations are less resilient. You see that now across many of the small island states, both in Asia and in our own hemisphere. And disruption of global supply chains and employment due to flooding of manufacturing centers, rice and wheat shortages due to drought. Okay, direct threats, which we'll talk about second. China is really positioning itself as a global leader on climate change now, and it is taking advantage of its ability to monopolize Asia's water. And third, we could also talk about the Arctic if we have time. That's a very interesting, China in the Arctic is a very interesting newer development. Okay, the indirect threats. There are really three I want to talk about. Migration, supply chain, and food insecurity. Okay, climate change is going to cause the displacement of millions of people throughout Asia and trigger large-scale migration. We already see that much of, for example, Bangladesh, good portion of the population lives at or below sea level, already experiences regular flooding, already beginning to migrate towards India for a combination of economic and other reasons. India has built a fence to keep the Bangladeshis out. Small island developing states and Pacific nations, they face an existential threat. For example, Kiribati could actually disappear entirely by 2030 and is already beginning to make arrangements to move its population. So those are sort of very specific and very important cases. It's going to open up a whole new field of legal and international legal issues as we have whole populations who are going to be displaced. Australia and New Zealand in particular already working with some of these small island developing states to address those issues. In some areas of Vietnam, if you've ever been down on the lower Mekong, you can see, it looks like you're almost watching the water rise and as you're going down the river, and you can't imagine how they continue to farm and fish. They're almost underwater there, but several meters of erosion wash away each year because of climate change. Coupled with negative environmental impacts, they've destroyed the mangroves and harmed many other areas. So internal migration is going to threaten political stability in some countries, as was the case in the flooding in Pakistan in 2010, which left 10 million people homeless, and the country was already struggling to reintegrate populations displaced by fighting among the Taliban. Okay, so I already mentioned Bangladesh and India. There's also this whole emerging area of, are these migrants or refugees? International law doesn't fully address this issue of climate displacement, so I think this is a whole new coming area. Okay, second, industry disruption. Climate change-induced flooding threatens manufacturing centers throughout Asia, and it's going to impact global supply chains along the world's economy. China's Pearl River Delta is particularly vulnerable to climate change. It's gone from farmland to manufacturing powerhouse in a matter of decades. China will suffer the most direct economic harm from river floods, losing more than close to $400 billion in economic losses from flooding by 2035. And flooding also threatens factories in South Asia. The 2011 floods in Thailand disrupted supply chains for automotive and electronic components, resulting in a global shortage of hard drives. And I think this is just the beginning. Okay, third, food insecurity and price shocks. food insecurity and price shocks will occur more frequently in a world impacted by climate change, as temperature, droughts, and flooding affect crop yields. Asia is a producer as well as an importer of food, and there are going to be regional differences in the impacts of climate on food disruption. But Southeast Asia produces 30% of the world's rice. Thailand and Vietnam account for slightly more than half of the world's rice exports, and Indonesia and the Philippines produce significant amounts of domestic consumption. So South Asia is going to be particularly hard hit by climate change, and the largest number of food insecure persons currently live in South Asia. So when Russia several years ago instituted a grain export ban following severe heat wave and lackluster harvest in 2010, prices spiked in the Middle East, erupting into the Arab Spring. So we can see that this more food shocks and disruptions are coming as a result of a climate-stressed world. Now, for the richer Asian countries like Japan, price shocks are less a matter of life and death, but they're still going to have important geopolitical implications. China, Japan, South Korea, they're all major importers of grain and vulnerable to price fluctuations based upon climate events. And the Chinese government has made national food self-sufficiency a priority, even as projections indicate that negative impacts on wheat and maize yields in China are inevitable unless significant technological leaps are made in production. So China has tried to mitigate its exposure to these key food choke point risks. So more than half of the world's staple crops, wheat, maize, rice, and soybean, have to travel along a handful of inland and maritime routes to a small number of key ports. So China is trying to diversify its supply routes, for example, building a railway across South America to lessen reliance on the Panama Canal. Okay, in addition to crops, there's also fish, and fish stocks are suffering the effects of climate change. In my view, which is one of the reasons China's most interested in the Arctic. Asia produces 50% of the global fish capture and 90% of the world's aquaculture. And the poorest fishers and others dependent on fisheries and subsistence aquaculture are going to be the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, particularly those in the small island developing states. Economic distress in fishery villages has the potential to encourage illegal trafficking and trans-border criminal activities, something that we're already beginning to see quite a bit of. Okay, I meant to put this slide up earlier. So these are some of Asia's climate hotspots. You can see it's a bit of a complicated slide, but it actually shows a number of the impacts of climate change that we've just discussed. Now I want to talk about sort of water and the direct threats. Because of all the important resources stressed by climate change, none will be felt more keenly than the need for water. China, through its presence in Tibet, controls the headwaters of 10 of the major rivers in Asia, and with the lone exception of the Ganges. This means the future of water allocation throughout the continent rests upon the political and policy decisions of China. So as Jack talked about, China leads the world in investment in many of the renewable energy technologies like solar, and has taken a strong position in wind. But it emphasizes engineering rather than management solutions. While water has historically been a catalyzer of cooperation between countries, there's a good chance that this dynamic could shift as climate change places greater strain on resources and megadams that increasingly offer the opportunity to shape river flows. So China's infrastructure projects put it in a position to monopolize Asia's water supply. And there's some evidence that it's begun to do so. I think this is going to be, for those of you who want to explore non-traditional security challenges in Asia, I think this is a very important one to watch. In particular, China's hydroelectric dams along the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra River in Tibet have prompted an outcry from India. Indian leaders point to China's north-south water diversion project to divert water from the Brahmaputra for industry and cities in the north. Although China's disavowed any such ambitions, engineers and policymakers have pushed for this project. China's also dammed and controls the flow of the Mekong. Downstream neighbors have protested that the country now occupies an untenable position of power. And Chairman Mao famously said, "Southern water is plentiful, northern water is scarce. If at all possible, borrowing would be good." Borrowing some water would be good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Arctic. And I didn't bring my Arctic slide deck today, but we can use this other slide there. If you look up, China had issued its first Arctic policy in January of this year. And it was notable because they declared themselves to be an Arctic stakeholder. They've been already an observer at the Arctic Council for several years. And you can begin to see now the Polar Silk Road emerging. Most of you know about the Belt and Road Initiative that is linking China across Asia and across South Asia into Europe. But there's a Polar Silk Road emerging that will link China up through, if you see that blue line on the slide over there that divides Alaska there from Russia through the Bering Strait. That is a route that China and others will use to transit up into the Arctic. And what's interesting is that in this Bering Strait region here, just a few years ago, there were maybe only tens of ships that went through each year, and in the last year there's close to 300. So as the ice recedes in the Arctic, China is first looking to transit across the northern sea route, which runs across the Russian Arctic border. Russia has the longest Arctic coastline. But they clearly have their eye on the future opening of the Arctic through the central Arctic Ocean, which could provide for China an opportunity perhaps to transit global waters free of either the U.S. control in the Straits of Malacca and Hormuz today, or Russian control along the northern sea route. That central Arctic Ocean route is not yet open and won't be for a number of decades, but we all know that China takes the long view and is looking to the future. The real prize, I believe, for China in the central Arctic region is the fish. Now, China is among the nations that agreed to the Central Arctic Fishing Moratorium, which was negotiated last year among the Central Arctic nations and a number of others. And that provides that for the next 16 years, there's a moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic, where there's not yet an established fishery. But fish stocks, as they're being depleted in warmer waters and fish stocks are moving northward, we've seen much more productive fisheries, for example, between Norway and Russia and in colder waters. So eventually there will likely be a fishery in the Central Arctic, and the signatories to this moratorium have the opportunity to study that region for the next 16 years. And there's a lot that goes into the research and study in the region that will enable knowledge and know-how for future fisheries. So, okay, with that, I think I want to conclude here by saying that perhaps climate change's most ominous impact with the U.S. is its interplay with China's increasing efforts to challenge American dominance in the region. China is now positioning itself as a climate leader, when we all know that, of course, it's among the most and has polluted its country significantly, harmed the health of its own citizens, and yet it's positioning itself, with the U.S. absence in this area right now, to be a leader in the region and even beyond. Most countries in the region do not want to have to pick between the U.S. and China's leadership, and states will alternatively accept or reject or manage China's growing influence. So while we have, on the U.S. side, not taken up the mantle of leadership right now, China is using this as an opportunity both to position itself on climate leadership and at the same time to advance its position strategically with respect to the region's water resources. Okay, with that, I'll look forward to our discussion.